whether we use alternative medicine or alternative therapies. The Dalai Lama is considered the embodiment, the incarnation of Avalokiteshvara, the Buddhist aspect of compassion.
Welcome to Awaken Florida. I have here with me Mr. Rajiv Mehrotra, who's an expert on healing, and he's worked very closely with the Dalai Lama, and he's here to share his wisdom with us. Welcome, Rajiv, to the show. And what awakens you?
Well, let me first tell me what awakens me is that to confront the reality that I'm not an expert in healing the mind. I struggle with my own mind a lot of the time.
Don't we
And
all?
So, exactly. So I'm not an expert, and I just have some sort of perspectives and thoughts about healing the mind and about the mind itself. And essentially to say that I think very often we look at the collaterals rather than the mind itself, except when it causes us or draws attention to itself, which is usually when it's under stress or unhappy or experiences pain. And the time to be looking at the mind is when we have equanimity and poise. And I think one of the culprits is the great American dream of happiness.
Life, liberty, pursuing happiness.
Yes, and I think that while the pursuit of happiness is a noble, legitimate aspiration, I think achieving it is far more challenging.
You said you brought a lot of stuff, and speaking of the Dalai Lama, one of his favorite quotes for me, or at least his observations, is about the mind. He said, if you're a wealthy person who owns a penthouse in New York, but you have a very diseased, unstable mind, what you'll want to do is jump out the window. So, in pursuing happiness and in connecting happiness to material gains or material needs, we've lost that connection, if you will, on how important it is to have a equanimous mind, poised mind, equipoised mind.
I think the problem really is not with acquiring or fulfilling material needs. I think Gandhi famously said that there is enough for our needs, but not our greeds.
Yeah.
So to seek to fulfill our needs is entirely legitimate and desirable in some ways. And it's just a question of defining what our needs are. And so you need something which has four wheels and is reasonably comfortable and air-conditioned these days. If someone else needs a bicycle and someone else needs a private aircraft. It depends on what they're doing and what their need is. So it's when our needs become greed that the problem and the challenge arises. So if we can use what we need in order to make a difference in the world and move beyond our own self and our own sort of experience or our obsession with our happiness, that I think whether you want to say equanimity or equipoise or whatever comes up.
So Rajiv, tell us about what brought you into this line of work, your personal journey or transformation, if you will, that made you pursue this.
Well, for me it's not work. It just is something that I have no choice but to pursue for my own equanimity and my own sense of contentment and being able to live a meaningful life. And of course all these are open to interpretation and discussion.
Sure.
What is a meaningful life, etc., etc., etc. But I often say that, and certainly this morning, was that suffering or craving or dissatisfaction is inherent in the human condition. And evolutionary, in terms of evolutionary biology, we are driven to manifest ourselves and to simply be.
Yeah.
And it's when we expand that being or rather expand it to include other people, then the sense of the self, the I that suffers, diminishes, because then we're distracted from meeting and fulfilling what I need to what we need. And I think it's that movement from the I to the we that is really our aspiration, or needs to be our aspiration. And I think there's a difference between a diminishing of the I and forgetting the I.
Yeah, that's true.
I think we're in trouble if we forget the I, because we need a certain element of the I-ness in order to function and in order to, in fact, manifest and practice compassion.
Sure. You can't sacrifice yourself.
So, well, I wouldn't use the word sacrifice, but you would expand yourself to include others.
Sure.
And hence soften is the word I prefer,
Oh, yeah.
rather than exclude or eliminate. So it's really soften the sense of self, because we need a sense of self to function.
Yeah, absolutely. No, when sacrifice, I specifically, let me try to clarify. You know, sometimes people put aside their needs. I mean, it's one thing about being overly self-obsessive, but the other is, you see mothers with children, in Indian families, even Asian families, cultures, where people kind of give too much, and then they feel, hey, you're not giving back. Then there's some kind of expectation. So I was talking in the sense of that.
But the problem is not with giving too much. The problem is with perceiving that you're giving too much.
That's true.
It's relative.
That's true.
So I think I think the challenge is that.
Yeah, perception, absolutely.
And not just perception. It is that I think each one of us, needs to evolve. I often describe it as our own mental diet. That's one of my favorite sort of pitches, as it were. And so what a diet that works for me, or the degree of giving that works for me, may not be appropriate for you.
That's true.
And so I think we make these generalizations usually to console ourselves as to why we are miserable, is because I'm doing too much for other people and not doing enough for me. So the me still comes in. The me has still begun to assert itself.
Yeah.
So you're not really giving too much or giving of yourself. You're still giving it for me. And I think that's the challenge.
So tell us about your experiences both in India and your other, in your travels. Like what message resonates? Like, of course, cultures are different, but what's kind of the resonating message? It's like, what's everyone struggling and suffering from?
I think everyone is struggling with struggling. And I don't say that facetiously at all. Because inherent in life, in the human condition, is that we will all experience pain, suffering, the loss of a loved one, illness. The great masters have, fall ill.
Yeah, sure.
And so we're all going to go through that. And so we all went through COVID, and to different degrees. So that's going to happen, and we're going to suffer. And it's reasonable and all right to suffer. But it's how we relate to our suffering, and whether we're able to not suffer our suffering. The problem arises that when even what is legitimate suffering seems too much for us to deal with. When you see someone else suffer, how can you not, if you're a human being, not feel their pain or empathize their pain?
Sure.
So we're not looking at an anesthetic that will somehow take away, or we shouldn't be looking at an anesthetic that will take away pain and give us, eternal happiness. That's not possible.
Yeah. You mentioned COVID, and I want to drill down a little bit, because if you look at what's happened to the world, especially in the United States, India, other places where you know people, there's almost been this dichotomy. Some people used COVID as a chance to reevaluate their lives, use that time for lockdown to reconnect with family, maybe cut back in the business travel they're doing. A lot of times it was involuntary, while other people used it as an opportunity to just do more drugs, eat more, drink more, put on 20 to 40 pounds, and they're worse off. So coming out of the pandemic and the mental challenges and the psychological challenges that people are faced with, what's your kind of one or two prescriptions for people to recover their past lives? Just going back to 2 years ago seems like ancient history. Like that sense of freedom, or something has been lost, it seems.
Well, something has been lost and something has been gained, as you pointed out, and that really depends on the individual and the individual sensibility. And the challenges I think I pointed to was that we wait for a catastrophe before being
yeah,
able to prepare for it. And so there's a wonderful word called resilience. So we need to nurture resilience so that when the vicissitudes of life, and today it's COVID, tomorrow it could be something else, so we should use the time whenever it's available to nurture resilience. So whenever we need to confront the inevitability of what life holds for us in so many different ways, we are better prepared for it and able to learn and evolve from it, so that the suffering of suffering diminishes. We are going to suffer. If there is COVID, you're going to suffer. It's painful to have COVID. It's painful to see people die. People who die because there isn't enough oxygen. How can you be indifferent to it? How can you be happy about it? So we have to give up this utopia of eternal bliss to a more realistic expectation, to be able to live comfortably with the challenges of life.
How do you cultivate resilience in your own life?
Well, I try and do that by trying to nurture compassion. And when I say compassion, I think the operative part that I must sort of share with you is that, and what our civilizational heritage in India teaches us, really, is the methodology. So what we've been exchanging is wisdom.
Yeah.
But how do we achieve that? How do we impact our deepest reflexive responses so that when it happens, we can maybe talk more eloquently about it,
Sure.
but how does our response change? And India's civilizational heritage offers the most sophisticated mind training techniques that enable this to happen. So just like we spend hours exercising physically,
Sure.
we spend longer hours beautifying ourselves. Some years ago, I might have wished I had more hair.
Yeah.
Or whatever it might be, whatever
sure.
we feel we lack at
Yeah,
any time.
yeah.
It could be a partner, it could be a more expensive car, and what have you. We train for our professions, we train for our sport, we train for everything, but we don't train our minds. And so that really is what we need to use, and what we need, the shift we need to experience is that we need to look at the techniques, secular techniques that have stood thousands of years of product testing. So this is not some new drug or a new perspective that someone is offering you.
Sure.
This has stood the test of time. And there can be no reason or logic to not engage with it and try it.
Yes.
And what are the simple elements of it? The simple element is that just as we give ourselves a physical diet of certain kinds of food that we know will help us and others that will not, similarly we know, we can learn and train ourselves that our mental diet is what we feed our mind.
Sure.
And our mind responds, just as our body does to the food we eat, to the mental diet that we give our minds. And through meditation, which is really just a practice of training the mind, just like playing a sport or lifting weights or going to a gym is training the body, meditation is an exercise in training the mind. And so there can be no logical reason why we don't invest in training our minds. And so just like each one of us needs a different mental diet, needs a different physical diet, we need a different mental diet. So the mental diet, what might work for me, or the kind of food that might work for you, may not work for the other person. So we have to try and identify the particular mental diet that works for us.
Sure.
So some trial and error, and train the mind.
So when you speak of secular, you mean, of course there are different meditation traditions. Some just focus on the breath, while others have a mantra or a chant, like an invocation. What's, in your experience, which is universal? Breath is universal.
No, it's not. Breathing is a universal.
Okay.
But
Thanks for clarifying.
breathing working with the breath as a form of training the mind is not universal.
Okay, thank
So
you.
there are different techniques, and some of them close on them. But the breath, of course, has a relationship with the mind. And we believe that many of these techniques are really anesthetics. They don't change the mind. They relax the mind. So there is an
Sure.
obvious connection between the body and the mind. So if you slow down the body, the mind naturally slows down. But that doesn't mean that the mind has changed. So to control your breathing is perhaps more like taking an antacid. It solves the problem of
reflux.
heartburn, reflux,
Yeah.
but it doesn't take away the cause.
Root cause.
And so the root cause is that you have to, whatever is creating these imprints in your consciousness, that determine subsequent action. This is not Eastern philosophy, this is the Western psychology too. I mean, when we talk about young people and the impact of their life's experiences on their later lives, it's the same thing.
Sure.
That what they've been through is what are the thought processes or the thoughts and ideas that have been imprinted on them at a time when they could not voluntarily process them. So as we grow older, we are far more in control of what we expose ourselves to. So at the very mundane level, and we know there's a lot of talk about what cell phones are doing to us, what television is doing to us, television images, what they're imprinting in our consciousness. So we believe that in the Western therapeutic traditions, when you really get people into therapy, they sort of bring that to surface. And very often it's not possible for people to be able to process traumas that they may have been through and to deal with them at a later time. So like the antacid, but mental antacid, we look at antidotes, and we believe that the universal antidote across all religions, all traditions, all practices is compassion. So whether, and you practice compassion both through your actions and through the intent of the action. So which means that if I'm performing a compassionate act, or doing something that manifests compassion, if I'm doing it purely because it will benefit me, then it's not truly compassionate. So we need to re-educate ourselves and our minds so that we are able to practice compassion and soften the sense of self, not eliminate the self, because you wouldn't be able to function if there was no self. In the traditional way that we understand it, of course, when we begin to look at it philosophically, there is no self. The self is merely a designation. So what we say, the self does not exist independently. It depends on causes and conditions. And a very useful example of causes and conditions is, for example, if you just take ice cream. Now, ice cream exists because there are certain causes and conditions. You remove the temperature changes and the ice cream is no longer ice cream.
Yeah, it's liquid.
It's something else.
Yeah.
And even if you try and reconstitute it, it won't taste the same. It won't be the same ice cream. So similarly, the sense of self depends on X, Y, Z. And so it's really just a question of softening the self so that the self that experiences it, because the harder, the more concrete, and the more established, and the more, strong the sense of self is, the more you will suffer suffering. You can't eliminate it.
Great, Rajiv. How do people follow you? How do people follow your work?
Oh, I don't do much work. I mean,
your insight and wisdom. Is there any links you can give our audience so that they have a follow-up?
I am just a student and a seeker like you or anybody else who's looking to find ways out of my own sense of suffering. I mean, I'm no qualified teacher or guru or anybody. And, we're fellow human beings who share this planet, and I'm happy when I get an opportunity to share my experiences. I do not believe I have definitive wisdom and the final word.
Oh, thank you so much for your insight and wisdom. We look forward to having you on the show again. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure.